Did you ever notice in the Gospel of Luke how Jesus keeps showing up in a lot of out-of-the-way places? We find him in a barn at his birth. Then, according to the author of Luke, things seem rather normal for a while. Jesus is circumcised and named. A little later comes the ritual of purification, the offering of a sacrifice, the dedication of Jesus to God. As far as we know, while Jesus is growing up, the family lives in their home, in their town, with their neighbors, pretty normally, celebrating their religious traditions, living their lives, with Jesus continuing to mature, obey his parents, to learn, grow in wisdom. Of course, we read in Luke a bunch of rough, dirty shepherds do show up at Jesus' birth. And there were those puzzling experiences at the temple with devout Simeon and the prophet Anna, with Jesus teaching the adults in the temple when he's just 12 years old. Jesus does have that rather eccentric cousin John, but otherwise things seem pretty normal for Jesus and his family. People seem to like him. Jesus seems to have God's blessing upon him. Though Jesus does seem to develop a rather remarkable propensity for ending up in deserted, lonely places. Did you ever notice that? When his interesting cousin John comes in from the desert, where the Holy One has touched his life, John begins to baptize folks in the Jordan, and old Jesus goes down to the river with the crowds, waiting with the others for his baptism, that experience when he hears God's claim on his own life. But in the next moment, Jesus does not rush off to seminary. He doesn't start a new synagogue or a new cult of Judaism or begin his ministry teaching the crowds or healing someone. As soon as Jesus comes back from the baptism in the Jordan, the Spirit whisks him off into the desert for a long time. It's out there in the desert where Jesus begins his journey of discovery, learning what it means to live in sync with the Holy, preparing for the journey ahead, becoming open to what he will discover along the way. It's out there in the desert, Jesus gets a whole lot clearer about who he really is. It's out there in the desert, a simple place, free of the usual distractions, rid of the day-to-day conflicts of interest, a simple place where his attention is focused in the very moment, where self-awareness becomes more possible, a simple place where the present reality captures the heart and the soul. It's out there in this simple desert place Jesus finds himself, gets to know himself, gathers his resources, opens his mind and his spirit to the holy, gaining strength for what will come next. And then Jesus' ministry begins. But as I said last week in Luke's Gospel, Jesus has to make some important life-defining decisions right out of the starting gate. Having become clear about his true identity, the place of the holy in his life, the direction he is going, he clearly proclaims to the people who he is and what he is about. You may remember from last week, this doesn't go so well. In fact, it goes rather badly, and people drag him out of town, hoping to kill him by throwing him off a cliff. But Jesus just walks away, heading off to other towns. Now, while I am not sure, I suspect he walks. And if you look at a map, it's quite a trek through the desert from Nazareth, where the angry crowds are after him, to Capernaum, the next stop Luke tells us about. Now again, while I do not know for sure, Jesus may well be traveling alone. In Luke's account, we have not yet heard anything about disciples. At this point, Luke hasn't told us about anyone accompanying Jesus. But in this time of danger, with people trying to kill him, Luke does tell us Jesus leaves the people heading out through the desert with lots of time to walk. There's time to clear your mind. Open yourself to the Spirit. Time to gain new perspective. Let new thoughts emerge. Jesus again enters that lonely place where you can be reminded of what's important. Have your passion rekindled your soul by the Holy. Allow the Spirit to still the confusing voices swirling in your mind and give you clearer, simpler focus. At the end of the long, dusty desert road, maybe walking alone with few distractions, Jesus again spent time in that quiet, sometimes lonely space. And arriving at Capernaum, Jesus apparently is energized, ready to continue his work. We find Jesus again teaching with authority and power, greatly impressing everyone, casting out demons, healing Simon's mother-in-law, curing people of all kinds of diseases. It's a very busy time. And the next thing we know, Jesus goes off again to a lonely place where it's more difficult for the crowds to find him, where he can be prepared for the next thing God has for him. Sometimes it just gets to be too much. Sometimes, if you're going to be effective, move into life with conviction, clarity, and power, you just have to get away for a time. And we find Jesus alternating between rigorous work on the sacred journey God has for him and time away from everyone. Time with just the Spirit of the Holy present and near. There are times in Luke's account we find Jesus entering a quiet, lonely place, moving from the crowds into solitude, from the noises and busyness to quietness, to find vision and focus, to gain strength for what lies ahead. We'll find him there several times. And soon, beginning in just 2 weeks, as we move through Holy Week, we will find Jesus with the crowds on Palm Sunday, then with just a small group of followers, first at the Passover meal, then walking out into the night that none of his followers could have ever imagined. But as the toughest time of his life moves onto the horizon, we find Jesus going off by himself to a quiet, lonely place to pray. In a society like ours, this whole sermon may seem totally irrelevant. In a society where our work hours are longer and more is expected, where lunchtime is nearly non-existent except maybe the power business lunch, where children seldom can play freely but are hustled from one activity to the next, where we sit in meeting after meeting with more and more talk, sometimes equating this with effective work. In a society like ours, entering a quiet, lonely place can seem impossible. Even finding a quiet, lonely place may be challenging. And then I wonder if thinking of a quiet, lonesome place as a good and positive space is so foreign and frightening to us, we avoid the quietness, the stillness, the slowing down, and keep living life in a noisy, busy world that may still leave us feeling lonely. When was the last time you shut down your desktop computer, walking away without your laptop, iPad, iPod, cell phone, BlackBerry, smartphone, all alone without all of your electronic devices? Remember the last time you were on an airplane and the announcement comes, you have now cleared a certain height and some electronic devices may be used. The sight and sound of people rushing for their gadgets is truly amazing. Now, I'm not saying these things are bad. I'm just wondering if we can ever turn them off. If we ever can get away. If we ever can enter the still, quiet, sometimes lonely space where we may meet God profoundly. Can we follow Jesus into the lonesome valley where we may find ourselves, be renewed and energized, and realign our lives with the Holy? Sometimes, to get clear about who we are so we can live our lives with integrity, we need to enter the lonely place. Sometimes, in the midst of danger, we need to retreat to the the lonely place. Sometimes, when the demands of life become too much, we need the quiet stillness of the lonely place. For in the quietness, the Spirit of the living Christ moves freely and noticeably in our lives. Our identity becomes more solid and sure. What God requires of us is revealed. How to love mercy and do justice and walk in partnership with God becomes clearer. In quietness and in trust shall be our strength.